Okay, we mentioned the Anabaptists in Switzerland, and they were originally part of the Mahoney's movement. They broke over the idea of baptism because they saw baptism as an ordinance of the church that was meant only for the converted. They were saying Scripture, there was no basis for it. People got, Jesus himself was baptized. The people were coming from baptism when they believed. And so they were put to the test very quickly in that regard. And they were, one of the, I guess, the cruel ironies is that as they were deemed heretics after debate and their views were lost out to the Zwinglian views, if they didn't recant their beliefs, they would be put to death, oftentimes by drowning, with the idea being that, you want baptism so much, here you go. And so, and we talked about it a couple weeks ago, and it's again one of those things that, that bothers me, I guess is the best word for it. And it's the tendency to confuse heresy with the heretic. And I would certainly warn myself of that and other believers of that as well. So be careful you don't make that mistake. Heresy is something that we want to eradicate, we want to refute, we want to wipe out, if you will, not the heresy. You seek to convince people. There's times perhaps when you have to, I guess in extreme cases, mark people. But that is the exception to the rule, not the common thing. And we mentioned it, the early church is persecuted by the Jews, the early church is persecuted by the Romans, the early church is persecuted by the Catholic Church as it grows. Or the Protestant church, I should say, is, and when you see the very people that have been persecuted, we mentioned when the Christianity became legal, they began to turn on these pagan groups, and instead of seeing them as people to be won, they see them as people to be destroyed. We seek to destroy heresy, not heretics. We seek to win heretics to the faith. And so, as challenging as it is, and I don't say this as someone who does it regularly, so I guess there's an element of hypocrisy in it. But I've certainly done it many times in my life. When people come knocking at your door and want to talk to you about spiritual things, take the opportunity if you can. You have something that everyone needs, and because they hold a different worldview or they hold a different religious view, doesn't mean you can't speak to them. Doesn't mean you can't win people. How do they get won otherwise? Have we just relegated them to perdition because, they hold a different view? And so this was the extreme, unfortunately. Zwingli even went to the point of supporting it. And again, a lot of these guys would regret things later, have regrets that they went that far. But just speaks to the animosity that would come in. The core beliefs I put down here of the Anabaptist authority of the Scriptures, like all the other reformers would hold. The idea of discipleship. The idea that belief produces right behavior. And again, not like the sacramental system at all. It isn't that the right behavior, the lifestyle gets salvation, but they're saying that the salvation should be reflected in right behavior. And that would be, we would say, a biblical perspective, that the person who's been changed should reflect that change. And then discipleship. I said that, discipleship and love. Two elements of love. And one is that with other believers, that they would give aid to one another, and they lived in community, and they shared things in community. They lived communally, if you will. You still see elements of this today. I remember years ago when I was teaching at school, our headmaster knew people who were part of a community up in New York, Rifton, New York, and it was a Mennonite? I don't know if it was Mennonite. I think it was a Mennonite community. And we took a bunch of kids up there. It was very interesting. So there are people to this day live community. Remember, Chet, we did that job up in Amherst too? Wasn't that like a kibbutz kind of?
What do you mean,
Remember all those houses, we did some floors of those houses, the Jewish community?
yeah.
They were all those very simple houses and the wood
Yeah,
floors.
that was more like a green, would be,
Was it? Okay. I thought they were all Jewish, but.
yeah, they most of them were.
Okay. But these people lived communally, and they had everything in common. Well, not everything, you know, the material goods weren't.
Wives.
Yeah, we won't go down that road. But that was an element of it. And with unbelievers, one of the things they held strong to was the idea of pacifism. And, you know, that was a strong Anabaptist characteristic as time would go on. Now, you don't see it necessarily in these early days when they're fighting for their own existence, but you know, you would see their descendants through the years, you know, the Amish and the Mennonites, and that was another thing from the kids. The Mennonite community, they educate their kids at home for the first 8 years. And when they get to high school age, they would ship their kids off to the public high school. And the idea was that they would expose them to the world so they could see the world. And I think psychologically the idea was they would beg for the community again and keep them in the community. That's my own take on that. So we were meeting with the kids, so we had brought kids up there, so we were meeting with their kids, and you know, I was asking all the right questions, you know. Oh, what do you think about wearing these? Everyone wears the same clothes, you know, they wear the overalls and all this stuff, and the kids were very concerned with that. So I asked one of the kids, I said, what do you do? You're at school, and, you know, kids are kids. The high school guys are picking on your sister. What do? You're pacifists. You know, do you pray for them? Do you try and share the gospel? He looks around, he goes, I kick them. I've never heard in my life. I like you, kid. I kick them. So I don't know if that's okay. You couldn't punch him, maybe, I'm not sure. I never got a straight answer to the rest of that. He probably got dunked in the water afterwards for saying something like that, I'm not sure. And also the idea of congregational, the idea that they were baptized as true believers, and at that point they became believer priests. Again, that continuing theme that we see in the Reformation movement. And so, even today, like in the Brethren movement, they don't have pastors. They have individuals who might teach, but they don't have like a position or an office of a pastor. And then the last one, which would become very strong, the separation of church and state. That each church was distinct. It was a free church, if you will, it was autonomous. And you see some of the roots of that in some of our movements today with some of these independent churches that have no organization. That's not what I'm looking for. What's what I'm looking for?
Chart.
What's that?
Chart.
Just where there's no, like, denominational connection. Each one is its own church. I mean, there's no influence. I know when I was going to the Free Church in Westfield, one of the things they would talk, when I was asked them, because it was a new concept to me in that regards, and I said, you know, what is it in terms of doctrinal beliefs? And they said, well, each church is kind of its own church. So you could go to a church where they preach, you know, they're all going to share the same on the cardinal doctrines, but other issues, like they said, you might get a person who believes in eternal salvation in one, another one who doesn't in another church. So I thought that was interesting. It has a different take for me. But nonetheless, this idea of a separation of church and state, that would be free from that influence. And that would become, again, one of these distinguishing features of some of these groups that you'll see later on, some of the influence of the Anabaptists on people like the separatists in England. This idea that they didn't want to be tied to the state. They saw the weakness of having a universal church control and then seeing a secular government control. So they were opposed to it. And then just some of the different groups that descended from them, the Hutterites that were in Moravia. A lot of them settled in the northern Midwest in our country, in parts of Canada as well. The Hutterites are there. The Mennonites we see, they came out of the Netherlands with Simon Menno. And you see them in the Pennsylvania area, the New York area. There's probably some others. What's that?
In Kansas.
Kansas too? Was Dorothy a Mennonite? The Baptists, we talked about the General Baptists that came out of England, had Anabaptist roots as well. And one thing about the Anabaptists that was interesting, as when I was first studying church history years ago, I had always seen them, and I'm trying to think, it wasn't Cairns, the book, it was another book, it portrayed them as being really almost this lunatic fringe. Our book calls them, I think, the radicals. But one of the negative connotations came from a couple of groups. One, I think our book mentions the Munster. I don't know if it was Eddie or Herman, but the Munster group, where they had a problem where they had very strong, what we would call millennialist views today. The word they used traditionally is chiliism or chiliastic, that believed in a 1,000-year reign of Christ on the earth. And a couple of these groups took some of these ideas to some extremes and began to live in ways that were considered outside of the Christian experience, I guess you'd say. Some of them were multiple wives and all kinds of things going on. Became terribly antagonistic towards anyone not in their group, to the point of armed conflict, physical attacks on people. And my first thought reading it again was the whole the David Koresh thing in Waco. And again, I don't know, I'm just saying that was my first thought. But whenever you say something like David Koresh or Waco, people say, oh, crazies, a bunch of wackos in Waco, that whole thing. But they also had the reputation that they had in many circles because of some of these excesses. But I thought it was interesting that one of the points of contention was this chiliastic perspective, this idea of a millennial kingdom of Christ, which today is very much considered a normal view by many groups, is millennial reign of Christ. So that put them at odds with people nonetheless. And we'll wrap it up there, I guess. Calvin in Geneva, the last one for Switzerland. Calvin would be the guy who would perhaps have the greatest lasting influence out of the Swiss Reformation, in the sense that he had a very organized system where a lot of the Anabaptists didn't have the particular leadership. Again, because of their doctrine, they were believer priests. They didn't believe in a nation-state church, a state church, I should say. And so the development wasn't going to lead that way, not having all these great leaders or well-known leaders. Whereas Calvin, as I mentioned in the introduction, was a scholar of reputation previously. And when he was in Paris, he came under the influence of Lutheran teaching. And he became a prolific writer, although he wasn't the speaker necessarily. He became a great writer for some of the leading reformers at that time in Paris. And it brought him under great scrutiny from the leadership of the city. And they drove him and the others out, actually. And he ended up traveling to Switzerland, where it was a place where a lot of people on the run would go. And as he went there, he was invited to come to Geneva, one of the cantons, and to be one of their leaders. And he went and began to develop his organization for government. And his first try, like a lot of our first tries at things, he didn't do real well. Very harsh, very strong, rigid moral codes for the city. And again, you're talking about a system where the civil authorities governed all people, in the sense that you're taking this, at least their version of a biblical moral code, and enforcing it on everybody, whether they believe it or not. And it wasn't long until he got run out of town on a rail. You can imagine, not always going to be really popular being that way. You share the gospel with some people, they say, you're jamming it down my throat. Now you're trying to tell them how they can dress, how they can act. They can't chew gum, they can't wear their hair a certain way. You're being awfully lax on your observation of the Lord on Sundays, whatever the case may be. And so he is, he's kind of, doesn't make it the first time around. He is forced out of the city. And he'll be invited back in a couple of years as his followers gain more control of the city. And he'll come back and enjoy his time there for the rest of his life, governing as as one of these elders of the city. And we mentioned his Institutes of Christian Religion, his systematic theology of Reformed belief. And in his preface, he writes a letter to the King of France, who's persecuting, that drove him out there, persecuting Protestants there. And it was such a forceful apology for the faith that people, again, he was instantly elevated in people's eyes and who he was in terms of his intellect and his understanding of God's Word and how to apply it in these areas. And so not only was his institutes a big hit, but the fact that they saw him as such an intelligent person who also combined it with great courage and boldness. And people took to him and his leadership very quickly in that regards. And so we'll see him go to Geneva and establish, again, this organization, this system of government. And whereas Luther had the three major issues that were so big to him, the idea of justification by faith, the authority of the Scriptures, priesthood of the believer, the big emphasis for Calvin is the sovereignty of God. And, we'll see that in his theology as we talk about Reformed theology a little bit. Just the idea, when you think of Reformed theology, what does anyone think? What's the first doctrinal issue you think of with Reformed theology, if you have any thoughts? Anyone? Yeah, predestination, election, those things. Today that's still a contentious division with people. But that is the idea, but it's rooted in this idea of the sovereignty of God. And I'll just read it because I wrote it and I can't remember things that well anymore. God is the Lord of all things. From eternity he's ruled in his wisdom and his omniscience, and as such he carries out his will as he determines in his righteousness. And this is this bedrock of belief, that the all-knowing eternal God who's righteous, he governs the affairs of life. He does what he will. And because he is who he is, no one can hold him to account because he's God. No one can gainsay his righteousness because he is righteousness. Who is a worm of a sinful person to criticize and condemn God if he does something? And so his basis is the sovereignty of God. And so much of his theology obviously will stem from that. And it's significant because we see how it's going to impact not just his doctrinal issues like predestination and free will, but we'll see how it affects his idea of government as well. Because he's going to establish a system of government. Because he thought it was outrageous that any individual or any organization would claim some arbitrary power to rule. That the sole authority to rule was God's. And then by connection would be the people of God to rule. And so as he would establish his system, he had 4 categories of leaders for his government. And one was pastors. And pastors had the responsibilities you'd imagine. They would preach and administer discipline. They would carry out those responsibilities on a regular basis. The teachers had a role of teaching doctrine. They evidently didn't know the Granville-Sharp rule back then. They had pastor-teacher. There was pastors and teachers. They had deacons who did what you think a deacon would do. They administered charity to people. Just got that, Chad? A little bit of humor there. And then elders, this board of elders, if you will, who kept an eye on the constancy of the theology that was being communicated, as well as the morals of the community. And so this was the organizational structure of the canton. The idea would be that they would govern, and that as these people were chosen, these elected representative officials would be those who would represent the will of God through the study of Scripture, and this would be consistent with God's mind and hopefully the people's minds as well. And they held to this notion that we would see later on in the Mass Bay colony with the Puritans, is that this organized society was meant to be an example. The idea was that people could live in community together, could glorify God. In doing so, believers would be edified, they'd be built up, they would be growing and maturing as a result. And unbelievers would be drawn to this. John Winthrop used the example from Matthew, a city set on a hill. That everyone will see it, everyone will see and look and be drawn to it. This idea and that is, by the way, the same thinking that goes into the Mennonites or these Hutterites who live in community. When I was asking them, why do you live the way that you live? And their idea is that unbelievers would look. And I say, because you really think people would be drawn to this? I mean, realistically, at times I can be a little bit maybe too direct, but you really think people are drawn to this? You know, overalls and the Walter Warzak beard and stuff like this. You know, you think that's a big hit? Everybody wearing flannel shirts, women with the doilies and the long dresses and all that. That's not a big seller. But they say no. People will see how we live our lives, and they'll see the love that we have for one another. They'll see the care for one another. They'll see that people aren't in need. They're not wanting. They'll see that there's a genuineness of our love, both for each other and for the world. They'll see an exemplary character, and they'll be drawn to that. And it's that thinking that all these different groups hold to. Now, there's obviously a bit of hubris in that, to think that my way of doing things is going to be so amazing. And when you're done watching me, you're going to say, I want to be just like him. I mean, there's nothing, you know, as much as that may seem like it's true at times.
You rich.
But that was the idea. And again, I think in principle it's a great idea. I mean, that's how we should live our lives, isn't it? You know, the Charles Sheldon book, you know, what would Jesus do? That we would live our life in such a way that we would first think, how would Jesus want me to act? With the idea being that people are looking at my life, that we're the epistles that are written to people. And so, before I act a certain way at my job or in my family with my kids, whatever the case may be, I would think, what is the right response here? Because I don't want my kids to see this corrupt image of God. That's what Christianity is? You know, that's what it is? That's Jesus? I know he used a whip in the temple, but keepers, it's the third time today he used that. So, I told my kid, if you acted the right way, you wouldn't get that whip over and over again.
It's your fault.
Didn't make any heaven of it. So, and then I took the tulip, against my better judgment I did it. But I said, you can't talk about Calvinism and not say tulip, because that's how many people identify as theology. And it is an oversimplification of the Reformed doctrine. And probably most Reformed people would argue the point anyway, but it just breaks the principles down very simply. The idea being, the T of tulip being total depravity, and it's that thought that others have had, that we see that the fall of man corrupted the will of man, and man isn't able to choose for himself to follow God. Okay? And that would be, you know, Luther's position when he wrote The Bondage of the Will. It would contrast all these people who said that people can choose how to, you know, they can choose God. They use unconditional election, and that idea that a person is chosen by God apart from any merit of themselves. Okay, it has nothing to do with me, it has all to do with God. Limited atonement, that the work of Christ on the cross was only for those who were the elect. That the idea being that if God's choosing who he's choosing, then the people he aren't choosing obviously is of no benefit to them, it's not for them. And I'm not here to talk about the truth or fallacy of it tonight, so just don't wonder about that. Irresistible grace, that the elect are saved, and again, if election is unconditional, then obviously you already say, if God is choosing you, he's choosing you. It's like, you know, Yosemite Sam when Bugs Bunny's on the steamroller going downhill. You can stand there and say, stop, 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 when it hits you, it just rolls right over you. Nothing's changing. And so it's that idea of, and that's the idea that Calvin had in mind, actually, was Yosemite Sam, when he postulated this idea of irresistible grace. And then perseverance of the saints, that if you're the elect, if God has chosen you, not against your will, but without your choosing, if God has chosen you, then you can't be lost because he's chosen you. This idea that has nothing to do with you, so you can't undo it. If you couldn't do it, you can't undo it. And so, that's his thinking. And again, like Melanchthon in Germany, he instituted comprehensive educational systems to impart this. And again, some of the great influence of the Reform movement come from the works of Calvin in this regard. And we'll see the influences of Calvinism throughout parts of Europe. In France, the Huguenots, one of my favorite Reformation groups, which I don't talk about at all. But they were the French Protestants, severely persecuted in France by the Catholic Church because France was growing in power and influence in the Holy Roman Empire. And severely persecuted, and I'm trying to think of the date, and Dave will probably look it up for me in a couple of minutes, But the date of St. Bartholomew's massacre, and where in one night, like 10, 20,000 Protestants were killed in France alone, just in one night, as the church turned on them. And it wasn't until 1598, I do know that date, the Edict of Nantes, that they were granted the right to exist in France even. And the great line from the Huguenots, regarding the Huguenots, I should say, is, hammer on, you hostile bands.
1572.
Thank you. Your hammers break, God and will stand. And the Huguenots were known as the anvil of God, that for all the persecution they took, that they remained constant, and they survived it all, and that the hammers of the papal persecution broke, smashing against them so much. So the Huguenots in France, Knox, a guy I regret that we won't talk about at all tonight, outside of saying his name once or twice. Knox in Scotland, and the establishment of the Presbyterian Church in Scotland was one of the tremendous influences of Reformation, of the, I should say, the Reformed theology and the influence of Calvin, and more than just a nursery rhyme. You know, he was a man of tremendous zeal and vigor, and he took probably the work of Calvin a step farther, where, you know, the idea of resisting tyranny, he took that up a notch or two. And he resisted Mary, Queen of Scots, and the attempts to draw Scotland back into Catholicism with every ounce of his being. And the Netherlands, the Reformed Church broke away from Spain, the Roman Catholic Church, under the influence of Reformed leaders in the Netherlands. And then we talked about a little bit already, America, you see the Calvinistic influence in the Separatists and the Puritans. And the Separatists being what people commonly call pilgrims, and the Puritans the Separatists who settled Plymouth. Have you ever gone to Plymouth County, Plymouth Plantation?
Yes.
Yeah.
Great time. Really encourage you, if you've never done it, go, it's a blast. They do the, the in-character thing for the time period. You can have theological discussions with them, it's a hoot.
It is, it's
But it really is something to see, very striking, go to, now Chad, what was that movie you showed? What was it? Monumental?
Yeah.
monumental, yeah.
All my time going to Plymouth, I never saw that
I never
place.
did either.
So I'll have to go next time. But if you don't get a chance to go to Plymouth, I've seen that statue, which is dedicated to the Plymouth, the Pilgrims. Certainly the Mayflower, Plymouth Plantation, really just striking when you put it in the context of church history and all that. And, the devotion of these people to glorify God with their lives and to worship freely. So that brings us to the Reformation in England. And two elements to it, and we'll kind of skip on the soap opera side of it. The political, ecclesiastical break from Rome. Perhaps most of you know the story, it's stuff you read in the history books growing up. Henry VIII, he of the many wives, wants a male heir to the throne. Darn wives, they just can't give him a male heir. When you find out years later it's his fault. But nonetheless, he tries to get around this whole divorce thing and getting rid of his wife so he can marry another woman so he can hopefully have a male heir. Catholic Church won't do it. He convinces the Church in England through means of fines and coercion to break from Rome, to make him the head of the church. They will ultimately annul his marriage. He marries Anne Boleyn, and then he marries a bunch of other babes afterwards. He finally gets his son, who will take the throne when he dies. But he leads the break from the Catholic Church initially, and he becomes the head of the Anglican Church, which is the Church of England. And so it maintains pretty much everything else regarding the Catholic Church in terms of its structure, its sacraments and all that. The only thing that changes is papal authority. They don't respond to the leadership of the Bishop of Rome. And so the political side of it takes place. His son will come to the throne at a young age, 10 years old, I think. He has advisors essentially governing the country. They are sympathetic to the Protestants. They move in that direction. to support the Protestant Reformation in England, or anything that would lead along those lines. At that time, they pass bills that will allow for the priest to marry, the Act of Uniformity, which puts services now in the English language, gets it out of Latin, establishes a service that is going to be consistent throughout. What else we got here? Congregational worship. But he's a young guy, he dies a sickly kid, he dies at 16, and his sister, who ironically is the daughter of the first woman he was married to, Catherine of Aragon, who is, she's from Spain originally. Her parents were Ferdinand and Isabella of Columbus name. And so she's a Catholic, she's looking to move England back into the Catholic swing of things. And she is a persecutor of the Protestants. And she is well known through the writings of the book, Fox's Book of Martyrs, which great read in the sense of reading about the sufferings of the British Church in particular under her reign. And she tends to bring back Catholicism. In doing so, she puts to death many of the leaders of the English Church. Thomas Cranmer, who had written the Uniformity of Worship Act, he had translated the Bible into the English language. He had written down the Creed of the Anglican Church, which would later become known as the 39 Articles of Faith. He was put to death. Latimer and Ridley were put to death, important bishops in the country. And so, getting the moniker Bloody Mary, she lives up to that, persecuting the church tremendously there until her death. And her sister takes over, following her, Elizabeth. And Elizabeth is a half-sister of Mary, but she's a compromiser. She is going to seek to find a middle road, the middle way, I think they called it, the via media, which will allow the church to kind of settle down, get away from the hostilities, try and find a way where they can go back to the way it was under Henry. The Queen will still be the head of the church, but they will be sympathetic to both the Catholic Church and the Protestants and try and find a way to coexist. But that works in England, doesn't work for the Spanish, who are now one of the main forces in the Holy Roman Empire. The Emperor wants England back in the fold, the Pope wants him back in the fold, and so the King of Spain is going to move against Elizabeth, who, by the way, the King of Spain was the wife of Mary, her half-sister, Bloody Mary. He had asked Elizabeth to marry him after Mary died. She said no. Here we go, the soap opera. Anyway, he's going to invade England. The famous Spanish Armada, the greatest navy of its time, invades England. England with its, very small navy, very small ships, the large Spanish galleons, well armed. The battleships and aircraft carriers against the little dinghies of England. But a great storm comes up, affects the tides. The big ships can't maneuver. The little ships can. Sir Francis Drake and some of the other naval commanders of the British defeat the Spanish Armada and keep England from falling to the Catholics in Spain. And what the storm became known as the Protestant wind, interestingly enough, because they saw it as the providence of God that defended England against the Catholic return. And so that's the political side of it. Like I said, a lot of soap opera, but that is European history. If you weren't married to someone's sister or your own sister, then you weren't really getting anywhere in life.
Well, that's modern.
I know. We won't talk about Southwick in public places. Okay. Anyway, moving right on. The theological aspect of it. That doesn't sound like I can say those things. The theological aspect of it, the two major groups we want to talk about are the Separatists and the Puritans. We've mentioned them in part already. The Separatists looked at the Church of England and said, this is so corrupt. You can break from Rome. You are so Roman still, it is disgusting. There is nothing redeemable in you. We can't salvage anything from this mess. we're going to spit you out of our mouth, like the laity in church, and we're going to start fresh. Unfortunately for them, the Church of England wasn't so accommodating. Persecuted, harried, harassed. Many of them were forced to flee. Many of them go to the continent of Europe, particularly Holland, where the Reformed movement had made inroads there. They get safe haven in Holland, and then from there, many of them will go to the New World. We mentioned our own history with the Pilgrims coming to Plymouth. The great majority of those will be Pilgrims. The others will be who, by the way? Who are the other groups besides the Pilgrims or the Separatists that come in those early? Not the Puritans yet. They are the strangers, they're called. The strangers. They're the ones not of their group. They were probably people who had been in the Church of England and were unhappy or wanted a new start. The strangers.
And they're still here in New England.
That's right. We've always been strange, haven't we?
That's what we are.
And so one of the distinguishing marks of the Separatists, that again they hold to all the other Reformation things, but was their idea of voluntary covenant. The idea that the Separatists joined together in a voluntary covenant with one another. They agreed to their style of government, they agreed to their methods of worship. No one was being constrained to do this, this was voluntary. And you see that when they come to Plymouth, they had a charter to go to Virginia. And Virginia at the time was gigantic landmass. But where they landed in Plymouth was not part of Virginia. And so they realized they were about to get off the boat that they had no legal authority to set up a colony and to establish a government. And they could only, in their thinking, they could only imagine chaos resulting if there was no order. And so the Mayflower Compact became the first working government in American history. And it was an example of their theology, this idea that you came together in a voluntary covenant with one another. And so the idea that they would elect people, and again this idea of elective representative came out of the Reformed theology that we would see all throughout our history as a country. The idea of elected representative government that was supposed to speak the mind of the people. We've come a little bit of a ways away from that in a couple centuries, but nonetheless, the idea being that people were chosen because of their character, they were chosen for their wisdom, they were chosen because they were people who, although they may hold a different opinion, a different view, were considered people that could be trusted to lead properly. And, I won't go there, it's a second. But nonetheless, that's a very striking part of their ideas. Again, they held to that idea of the Anabaptist, the autonomous congregations, the idea of the believer priest, that they weren't answerable to any hierarchy. There was no separatist hierarchy they had to respond to and answer to for their behavior. And so that was the separatists. The Puritans were the group that looked at the Anglican Church and sought to reform it. The Separatists would consider the Puritans compromisers to some extent. And they would look at them, and 10 years later when they came to the Mass Bay County and say, I told you so. But the Puritans thought they could purify. They saw the Anglican Church as being corrupted, but not beyond being redeemed. They sought to bring change in the church the best they could. They fought to the best of their ability to bring about change through debate, through writings, through preaching. And their idea was that they could redeem what had been somewhat lost. Cambridge became the intellectual center. Cambridge University, which today is or Harvard is probably our Cambridge would be a better way to say it. It was a center of Puritan learning, and they failed pretty much completely at their attempt to reform the church, with one maybe exception, and that was the influence they brought to bear on King James, who would follow Elizabeth to the throne, to get a group together to get a new translation of the English Bible. which we know today is the King James Version of the Scriptures. And that was probably the one bit of influence they had. Otherwise, they really gained nothing in their time there trying to redeem it. And which led to what we call the Great Migration, usually considered from 1630 to 1640. The number of Puritans leaving England was about 20,000 people. So a large amount of people leaving. And Dave, by the way, what was that number again with the Gutenberg Bible? You said how many?
It was, interesting enough, it was, if you look at the timeline for the Reformation, it was about 25 years, around 1475, the first print. Within 25 years, they had printed over 20 million volumes.
20 million volumes
In 25 years.
of the Bible in 20 years. When you told me that at the break, I was stunned. It almost seems incomprehensible to me. They printed 20 million Bibles in the first 25 years. You know, and that's a non sequitur from this, but just thinking of the number of Puritans that came here to the Mass Bay County that fled England. You know, if the righteous perish, what's the nation to do? Think of England. 20,000 of its best citizens left in 10 years. 20,000, which is a large percentage of the population. You know, think of the effect the rapture of the church will have
Yeah, for sure.
when people leave, what that will do to society. You know, take the salt out of it. So the Puritans come and they establish, and they share this idea of covenant, by the way, the separatists. They have a covenant mentality, and they share that Calvinist view about the church model. And so they come to Massachusetts, establish a colony, which over the years, and we won't go into it because it's not the purpose of the class, but you know, the church, the state model in Massachusetts is interesting because of the form it takes and the history of it, some of the successes and some of the failures. But nonetheless, they come following those models. And then in England, those that remained continued to fight for reform in the church. Unfortunately, the Stuart dynasty, which followed Elizabeth, was pro-Catholic, very hostile. And so eventually open warfare broke out. There were actually Puritan troops, you know, armies that were formed. And at one point they actually did away with the monarchy for 5 years and had what they called a protectorate, where a Puritan leader, Oliver Cromwell, governed England for 5 years. But again, when you're a small minority governing a large population of people that are not in conjunction with your thinking, it doesn't work very well. And it, you know, again, most secular histories speak very poorly of Cromwell's rule, but imagine trying to govern people that are, you know, opposed to your view, and you're trying to impose moral standards and things like that. But Cromwell was significant. He led the Puritans that remained there. And then we're just going to close tonight with the Catholic and the Counter-Reformation. And I just separated the two, being the Catholic Reformation, speaking of the reform that actually took place in the Catholic Church, as opposed to the Counter-Reformation, which were the actions that were taken to suppress the Protestant Reformation or to kind of roll back the tide, if you will, of it. And one of the key elements of the Catholic Reformation was this organization, the Oratory of Divine Love, which was very informal, was never very large, you know, 40, 50, 60 people in it. And they were, initially, they just were a group of people that gathered together. And their idea was to strengthen the spiritual fiber of the people. And so they set about, through works of charity, through developing different spiritual exercises, was to see spiritual growth and maturity. They would be commissioned by the Pope to look into the abuses, what people saw as the abuses of the church, and try to bring about reform. And so out of this group came suggestions for how they could reform the Catholic Church. And so again, realize that it's not just, you know, the Jedi against the evil empire, this whole thing. You know, it's the idea that there are godly people who are seeking to reform the church from within, whether they were people like the Puritans, or whether they were Catholic lay people or leaders who saw the corruption and wanted to change it. And so this group, the Oratory of Divine Love, was utilized by the Pope in trying to address some of these things. One of their suggestions was a development of new religious orders that would kind of combine the monastic orders and your what you call the secular priests, the everyday priests. So they would be people who would take a vow of poverty, chastity, obedience, and yet they would work with the people. They wouldn't retire to some monastic cloister somewhere. They would be in the population every day and trying to bring about this reformation of manners, if you will, this idea of spiritual growth in people. And so they were one of the institutions that were used, and several, actually I think it was 2 popes came out of this group, guys who would later influence the Church of Rome to bring about reform. What am I at here? That's 8. That's 9, okay. And then the Counter-Reformation, I have 3 things in particular. One is the Jesuits, the development of the Society of Jesus by Ignatius Loyola. And just as go back a step, the Spanish had a large amount of influence, I said, during this time in the Catholic Church. Ignatius Loyola was a Spanish nobleman who sought to develop spiritual exercise for his own life and then began to train others with it, developing this organization, the Jesuits, which would be utilized by the Pope as spiritual warriors, if you will, who would go anywhere, face anybody, take on any task of the Pope to win back people to the Catholic Church or to convert people to the Catholic Church. And they said it didn't matter if it was infidels, if it was Muslims, if it were Protestants, it didn't make a difference. And so they were devoted to that. We know them today in America still through their educational system. I mean, I just Googled Jesuit universities and first of all, give me a worldwide list. And you see all these nations in the world with all these Jesuit universities. I looked at America, like around here, BC and Holy Cross and any of the saints just about here, saint colleges are Jesuit. But that huge impact in trying to bring Reformation to the church through education and some of the methods of Loyola, the idea of meditation, penance, examination of conscience. You see some of the mystical writings that would come out of this time period of the Catholic Church. And one of the things I thought was interesting, one of the characteristics of it was to forget what's been forgiven. Which is very, if you've been raised a Catholic, that's very anti-Catholic. The idea, man, I've still got a bit of a Catholic conscience at times, when it comes to things. But to forget what's been forgiven. Another element of the Counter-Reformation was the Inquisition, which was actually started much earlier. I think it was started in the 12th century. But it had its greatest influence in the 15th and 16th century. The Spanish Inquisition was probably the largest we know the best about, with Torquemada and all those guys. But it continued on to fight the Protestant Reformation as well. And that was just a church tribunal, church courts that would address heresy. And it was expanded greatly during the Reformation. And the accused were considered guilty until they could prove their own innocence. So direct opposite of our system today, and what was the English system at the time as well. And then the third element was the index. With the expansion, or the explosion, I should say, of written materials because of the movable type printing press, and as Dave said, 20 million volumes of the Bible in 25 years. The index was a list of forbidden books that Catholics could not read, and that people would be considered a heretic for possessing or reading. And so lists of books, all the Reformation writings, of course, people were forbidden from reading the Bible in their own language. And actually the index continued until I believe it was the 20th century.
1959.
Was it? Yeah. And the Inquisition was kept open until the 1800s, I believe. So the idea that these were mechanisms used to try to stop the influence of the Reformation. And then we see the Council of Trent kind of wraps up the Catholic Reformation elements. And the Council of Trent was held over a number of years. It had a number of sessions in like 3 different time periods. I think the first one was 1545 to 1547. They went like in 2-year increments. And the first one addressed questions of authority, we talked about before, the Vulgate, the Apocrypha, which are considered by the Protestants non-biblical writings, non-authoritative, non-canonical writings. And the tradition of the church was the final authority for the believer. It said justification by faith and subsequent works produced salvation, that the 7 sacraments were reaffirmed, and that they would look into means of reforming some of the abuses that were found through corruption in the church. And the difference being that they didn't say that any of the systems of the church were wrong, just that certain practices that were carried out by individuals were wrong. So it wasn't the system itself that was wrong, it wasn't broken. The second set of sessions in 1551 and 52 dealt with transubstantiation and other areas of reform. The last one dealt with the issues of marriage, purgatory, and moral reform. And all leaders of the Catholic Church, clergy, and lay teachers were required to abide by the council's decrees or be ruled heretics. 30 Years' War, at the end of this time period, is a civil war between Roman Catholics and Protestants. The end result, the Treaty of Westphalia, a couple of key things in regards to church history. Holland and Switzerland are considered independent Protestant states. They'll be free from the Holy Roman Empire. And actually, Holland was the only gain, really, after the initial Reformation period, the mid-1540s. It's really the only Protestant gain after that time period that came out of the Council of Trent. Lutheranism and Calvinism will both be recognized religious groups free of persecution. The lands that were Protestant before 1624 could remain Protestant regardless of the war. And that Protestants were given the right to hold offices within the empire. And then just to sum it up, we talked before about these things: justification by faith, main tenets of the Protestant Reformation, justification by faith alone, scriptures of the final authority of the believer, priesthood of believers, translation of the Bible into the vernacular, emphasis of all levels of education. And we mentioned in the introduction that this was the second great time period of the formulating of Christian doctrine in terms of a systematic way that could be put forth that people could understand. And at the same time recognize, that the Catholic Church and the Protestant churches still have shared views. For all the division, they both still hold to the early church creeds. Whether it be the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, the Athanasian Creed. They hold to that. Both groups hold to the teachings of the Trinity, the deity of Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus. The Bible as direct revelation from God. The fall of man. Original sin. Those are still things that both groups share. Certainly some key issues that there is disagreement on. But in many major areas there is agreement. And so there certainly are those who would, views of the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church and the relationship one with another, and the views of people, are interesting points of conversation, to say the least. But certainly recognize there are things in agreement there as well. And then just read that section of denominations. It's nice, so I'll stop there. But just read that last section. It just talks a little bit about denominations. And we'll talk about that again in the last session, the 6th week. So Father, we love you and thank you. And as we look at our roots and some of the growing that has taken place and the rebirth of certain beliefs, God, we pray that you would raise up men and women who would continue to search the Scriptures. Lord, that those things that may be lost to us even now, that you would open our eyes and our hearts to, that we could serve you, worship you, glorify you in a more clear way. And Father, we thank you for those who've gone before us, who have paid such an extreme price. God, in the name of truth, in the name of Christ. God, I think of those today who suffer for their faith, and pray that you would strengthen them even now. God, you'd be an encouragement to their families, to the churches. that in the midst of it, they would see your face, they would see you high and lifted up, Lord. And Lord, I pray like so many of these reformers that they would win a victory in those places, that the persecutor would become the worshiper. Lord, we pray that in some of the smallest and seemingly less important places, God, the tremendous revival would break out. We think of those overseas tonight in the mission field. We think of that church in Uganda, as Herman's been speaking about, the family in Kenya, God, for our friends in Tama, God, that you would just really bring revival there, stir them and strengthen them. God, for the Leonards in India, God, for the work in China with Mike and Abe and their kids, Lord, that you would just continue to do great things there. Bless that conference that's going to be going on. God, just strengthen and heal Mike. Lord, we thank you. Thanks, God. I love you tonight. Amen.